been really careful about sharing my thoughts on this election. I mostly haven't shared it in a public space just because I really needed to process and sort of really think about what I wanted to say. And not that what I have to say is so revolutionary compared to what other people have been saying. But I think it's pretty clear and it's pretty evident what happened. As for me, this was not something that was surprising in the slightest that Kamala Harris would lose to Donald Trump, because I felt like this was a direction that we were sort of headed in. Um, and this hasn't just been in the making when Kamala Harris became the head of the Democratic presidential nominee in terms of the ticket. This was something I think that has been going for much longer than that, heading toward this particular moment. And mostly because I know this as a journalist and seeing all the information that's out there on social media is that journalists, or very specifically, I should say, the Democratic Party, but it's also tied to journalism overall, they've lost the information war. And this is a defeat that was quite clear into how, some of the various campaign ads, which I'll get into in a moment, but also the way that people were processing the information. And, when you looked at any social media site, it was just flooded with misinformation. And I think we're at a point now in society where in our classrooms, on campuses, and just in our daily lives, that a lot of people need to be able to decipher between misinformation, disinformation, and truth. And a lot of the feelings that are evoked in this election, often a lot of it was led by misinformation. So I was not surprised. And I'm not saying that's the only reason that people didn't elect Kamala Harris. I think there were other factors that were at play. Uh, but I wasn't surprised. And here's proof that I wasn't surprised, because about a month ago, I was asked at an event that was put on by The Atlantic, where I also, write. I'm a contributing writer for The Atlantic, as many of you know, where I cover the intersection between race, sports, politics, gender, and culture. I was doing an event on Michigan State's campus, and I was asked who I thought would win this election.
If the election were held today, who's going to win?
Donald Trump.
If the election were held today, who's going to win?
Kamala Harris.
I think Trump will win. So clearly, I did see this coming, but I still don't think that makes it any more difficult to accept. As many of you all know, I've had my own personal history with Donald Trump. Back in 2017, I tweeted that the president is a white supremacist. These are words I still stand on, words I think that have been proven ever since then, and were proven before I said it. And that tweet, of course, changed my career. In many ways, it changed how people perceive me. It changed a lot of things. And the president, in response, he said I should be fired. He blamed me for ESPN's ratings being not healthy, apparently. And the then press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who is now the governor of Arkansas, also said that I should be fired. So, yes, I take the reelection of Donald Trump quite personally because of the person themselves, but also as a Black woman. And that is because I think for a lot of Black women, we can relate to Kamala Harris just in the sense of some of us have been in that position before where we felt qualified, if not overqualified in many respects. And for a lot of Black women, even though we should not internalize it this way, it felt like a particular rejection of some of the things that we've been fighting for, or it felt like a particular rejection of sort of our place and how we're seen in this society. And I don't think it's by any accident that both of Trump's presidential victories have been against women. Hillary Rodham Clinton, of course, in 2016, and now in Kamala Harris, because some of those same tropes have come up in both elections. And so it does make you wonder at what point, I hate to use the word ready, but at what point will America be ready for a woman to be in that role? I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves is like, what is it going to take? Because I see all this post-election autopsies trying to box around what I think was pretty obvious about how racism and misogyny were driving a lot of the coverage, the opinions, and even how the electorate saw Kamala Harris. And so if y'all want to fight about it, let's fight about it. But I think it was particularly evident. But now it's time to turn the page. And I think it's important as we think about what another Trump presidency could mean. I think it's important that we think about what this might mean in terms of the world of sports, because I think how a Trump presidency will impact the world of sports this time around will be a lot different than it was the first time around. Now, if you all remember from that time when Trump was first in office, he was able to use certain sports issues as a political football that helped more endear himself to his base, that maybe in some respects you could say grew his base. And one of those ways was his attacks on NFL players and Colin Kaepernick in particular, who in 2016, before he became president, Colin, of course, decided to take a knee to protest against social injustice. This became arguably the biggest story in sports, certainly a very important story. And so that gave us a window as to what to expect from a Trump presidency. Now, even though we don't have a Colin Kaepernick in this moment, I think one of the biggest things we have to look at is how Trump's plans for the U.S. Department of Education, how that may factor into how athletes are treated this go around.
We're going to end education coming out of Washington, D.C. We're going to close it up, all those buildings all over the place, and you have people that in many cases hate our children. We're going to send it all back to the states.
Now, of course, a lot of people are applauding this, which is kind of crazy to me, but I get it because a lot of us don't really fully understand the difference between how the Department of Education operates and how the State Board of Education operates. I think there is certainly a degree of satisfaction that people feel by the idea of disbanding a government department over an issue that a lot of people in this country aren't happy with, and that is education, even though by certain metrics it shows America is still one of the top places to be educated. Now, this isn't me trying to cape for our educational system, because when you do a deeper dive into where American students rank in math and science, that tells a much different story. The United States ranks 34th in math, 16th in science. And as someone who went to public school in Detroit, I know that a lot of inner city schools face a lot of educational challenges. But let's take a look at the Department of Education and how that correlates to sports. One of the most important elements of the Department of Education is enforcing Title IX. Now, I don't need to tell you the importance of Title IX, but in case you need to remember, it's the single most important piece of legislation in the history of women's sports. Title IX was enacted by Congress in 1972. Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in education. When Title IX was formed, it wasn't intended to be the bridge that necessarily opened the access point for women in collegiate sports, but that's essentially what happened. The Department of Education enforces and investigates Title IX violations. These violations range from investigating inequities between men's and women's sports inside of the athletic departments, and this part is really important, to also including investigating sexual assaults that happen on campus. Now, we have some indication of how Trump's administration will handle Title IX enforcement based off what his administration did the first time around and based off the plans laid out in Project 2025. You know, the playbook for his second term that Trump claims to not know anything about. That's what I'm talking about when I refer to Project 2025. Now, in his first term, Trump appointed Betsy DeVos as the education secretary. And one of the first things she did was take some teeth out of Title IX protections. Now, among the many new policies that Betsy DeVos instituted to Title IX, the most egregious was accused rapists were allowed to cross-examine their alleged victims in a live trial. Please don't tell me I have to explain to you why that is really fucked up. Based on what's proposed for Title IX and Project 2025, the goal is to make the process of filing a complaint for any discrimination that falls under Title IX painful and lengthy. And it would basically require those who come forward with Title IX complaints to have a legal team. It does everything possible to discourage people from coming forward for highlighting abuses that are happening in the system. And that doesn't just apply to sexual assault, but virtually any violation of Title IX. Now, as it is, There are some 80% of athletic departments that are not fully compliant with Title IX, although to various degrees. If Title IX is put under the Department of Justice or it's under the supervision of the state, Title IX, it may as well not exist. The Department of Justice isn't going to have much incentive to investigate anything, and the states may not have the resources to take it on either. Now, there's a lot of people saying that, again, this is a good idea to get rid of the Department of Education. But I'll go back to something I said previously. I need you all to understand how the Department of Education actually works. So in 1979, former President Jimmy Carter, he split off the Department of Education from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Now, what the Department of Education does is supplement state resources to fund a variety of programs. So here's one thing I want y'all to understand. There is a difference between the State Board of Education and the Department of Education. The State Board of Education, and this does vary by state, generally controls the curriculum, instructional materials, and handles accountability. They decide the textbooks and the regulations. So a lot of y'all that have a problem with the education in your community, that is a state and local issue, not a federal issue. The Department of Education is the enforcer of federal laws. They also oversee the financial aid programs and conduct educational research. So it's the Department of Education that oversees Pell Grants. And if that is abolished, that would disproportionately impact low income students. Now, I was a Pell Grant recipient, and without it, my student loan debt would have probably been astronomical. So this is a very key piece of what the Department of Education does. The Department of Education also oversees the funding for students with disabilities, including special ed, and for programs such as Head Start, which is used by nearly 800,000 children from birth to age 5. I was a Head Start kid too. So hopefully we understand the difference between these two departments and how they operate. But beyond Trump's promise to destroy the Department of Education, here's another way in which his presidency could potentially impact sports. You know who is really happy with not just a Trump presidency, but also the reelection of Texas Senator Ted Cruz? And that would be the NCAA. Let me hip you to some game. Ted Cruz is going to be the new chair of the Senior Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over college sports issues. And he has a very strong, very NCAA position.
The current state of affairs is the Wild West. When you combine unlimited NIL rights with an unlimited transfer portal, we are entering an arena where every player goes to the highest bidder, and the loyalties of players to teams and the ethos of college sports is at real jeopardy. We're also at risk of seeing a handful of giant mega schools with all the money creating super teams and the rest of schools unable to compete, which I think would be terrible. To have college athletics succeed, you have to have some modicum of parity.
All right, because before NIL existed, things were so equitable, right? The top programs weren't the same programs that were usually at the top every year. But you know what has happened as a result of this, quote, wild, wild west that Ted Cruz talks about is a school like Indiana, whose football program has largely on a historical level been terrible. But they went out, they got a good coach in Kurt Signetti. They made a huge financial commitment to him and to bolstering the program. They got 31 transfers, and now they are on the cusp of making the college football playoff. Did NIL stop Vanderbilt from upsetting Alabama this season? It did not. So the NCAA loves to see Ted Cruz coming to be chair of this committee, because another thing that Senator Cruz is solidly against is college athletes being classified as employees. The reason the NCAA is against that is because it opens them up to future lawsuits. And if athletes are employees, they couldn't do anything to restrict player movement. So maybe instead of some of you college football players who were doing the Trump dance when you were celebrating in the end zone, maybe some of y'all should have been studying up on how this election might potentially impact your pocket, especially if you are a college athlete in the state of Texas. Because the candidate that Ted Cruz ran against is a former Baylor linebacker who played for the Tennessee Titans, Colin Allred. Now, he has a much different opinion than Ted Cruz because he actually played college football and professional football.
Yeah, I wouldn't be where I am today without the opportunity that college sports gave me. The scholarship that I got at Baylor set me on the path to go into law school, to playing in the NFL, of course, but then also having a chance to serve in Congress. And so, to me, this is an incredibly important institution on top of being an incredibly profitable one. And as we've seen, this become such a big business now. It always had to come to this, that at some point the players who were generating so much revenue for everyone else were going to have to benefit from that themselves. As I said in that statement, I really struggled when I was at Baylor financially, and I was on scholarship, but after I paid my rent and my bills, there wasn't much left over. But at the same time, I was playing a video game, the NCAA football game at that time, with my player, number 34, middle linebacker for Baylor, 6'2", 235 from Dallas. And I wasn't seeing any of that revenue, right? And I think that wasn't right either.
Of course, another really big issue that Trump took on related to sports was transgender athletes. Now, I know poll after poll has shown that a lot of Americans disagree with trans women playing in sports or trans women playing in girls' or women's sports. And here's the ad that Trump ran to further bolster this home.
Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners.
Surgery.
For prisoners.
For prisoners. Every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access.
Hell no, I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to that.
Kamala supports transgender sex changes in jail with our money.
Kamala even supports letting biological men compete against our girls in their sports. Kamala is for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
But let me ask you something. Does the level of response to trans athletes meet the problem? Because for all of you that said inflation and the economy were your primary concerns and the reason you voted for Trump, where do you rank trans girls and women playing women's sports on the list of things that are priorities for you that actually impact your life? I ask that because of this. The trans population makes up less than 1% of the total population in the United States. But since 2020, 23 states have passed laws restricting trans athletes to participate in sports according to their assigned gender identity. There are 500,000 NCAA college athletes. Only 40 identify as trans, and that is trans women and men. Only one trans athlete in history has won an Olympic medal. Quinn, who won as a member of the Canadian women's soccer team at the Tokyo Olympics. So even the shortest glimpse of history shows you that this has not been a prevalent issue throughout. And I need to mention this about that ad that ran so successfully when both candidates were on the campaign trail. The reason why Kamala Harris said that she supported inmates receiving gender-affirming care is because it's actually the law. That same law Trump also had to adhere to when he was president. Now, this law is based off a 1976 Supreme Court ruling, which said states are responsible for providing health care to inmates. Now, transgender inmates were able to expand that rule to include gender-affirming care because they sued for the right to do it. So that is the law. So it doesn't matter now that he's president, that's not going away because it's based off a Supreme Court ruling. Now, of course, it could if it's challenged again in court, but so far that has not been the case. So for all those who were upset about the idea of your tax dollars paying for this, it's a law. That's why it's being followed. But I'll say this, one of the things I find so kind of disingenuous about the positioning of trans athletes as being the boogeyman and boogie women is that for years, by any historical measure, what has undermined women's sports the most has been lack of investment, lack of resources, lack of media coverage, and generally being considered an afterthought. Those are the things that have allowed women's sports to be vulnerable. So if you want to protect women's sports, then I would suggest you protect women's sports by watching women's sports, by investing financially in women's sports, and by making sure that the media covers women's sports with the same intensity that they cover some other things, particularly some men's sports. Those are the things that undercut women's sports. I'll just say in generally, as we think about, the impact that Trump could have on the sports world. The other thing I think is going to be pretty obvious this go around is that I think there's going to be a different normalization of Trump than what we saw before. Now, already, if you guys watched the UFC fight recently, that John Jones, where he won, the one that was in New York City, as you see, Donald Trump was there with Elon Musk, the House Speaker Mike Johnson, and John Jones did the Trump dance. You know, in the NFL, saw a lot of athletes doing the Trump dance. I didn't even know that was a thing. Saw a lot of college athletes, as I mentioned earlier, doing the Trump dance. And so, whereas before, I think there was this sort of toxicity that was around showing open support of Donald Trump, I don't think that will be there anymore. And I'm not sure if that's good or bad, particularly when you look at policy wise, some of the things he could do that could greatly impact and potentially undermine sports in a lot of ways, at least for certain communities within sports. And I'm really curious to see what happens when he's in the White House and it's that time where a champion in, any of the major sports and maybe even the NCAA champions, when it's time for them to visit the White House. If you remember from the first go around, a lot of athletes said no, most notably the NBA. Not nary an NBA team was in the White House to commemorate their championship during the Trump years. And to my recollection, most of the women's teams that won a championship weren't even invited to the White House. I mean, some of them went, and I think that had a lot to do with how that particular coach felt about Donald Trump. I'm thinking about you, Kim Mulkey, because Baylor, the women's team, was, I think, frankly, maybe the only individual women's team that went to the White House during his first presidency. But because of how much more normalized Trump has become, I wonder if that same resistance will be there. Another thing I think that has to be considered too is we know that Donald Trump loves to retaliate against his enemies, real or imagined. As I said before, he had no problem singling out Colin Kaepernick, no problem threatening NFL owners. He told them in particular, basically, they don't want to sign Colin Kaepernick and make an enemy out of him because, as he put it, him coming out and criticizing Colin Kaepernick was a quote winning issue for him. I am curious as to see if criticisms of Trump are a little bit muted because they know his propensity for retaliation. And certainly there was a very loud crowd that has always been there that claims that sports and politics don't mix. But I see already how those goalposts are moving as it relates to sports and politics mixing, because now that there are more athletes who are being more vocal about their support of Trump, I notice they're not being asked the same questions that Colin Kaepernick has been asked about his protests, or they're not holding it to the same standard as when LeBron James said that he was endorsing Kamala Harris and he sat at his locker and asked and answered every question about why he was choosing to support her. I'm wondering if that same energy is going to be kept with the athletes who are now vocally speaking out in support of Trump, because frankly, I think that's fair. I've certainly never been somebody who has ever wanted athletes to just shut up and be quiet, even if I don't agree with what they're saying. But once you throw it out there in the critical thought marketplace, people have a right to come at it. And certainly as a journalist, we have a right to ask you, well, why do you support this? What do you have to say about supporting someone who has been credibly found guilty of sexual assault in a court of law? That is a fair question to ask an athlete who is vocally supporting Trump. And so I'm just curious as to how the media begins to cover this in this moment. Because I have to say, I'm not sure if I have a lot of hopes, because in many ways, the media is responsible for us being in this moment now. And they've been complicit in certainly a lot of the misinformation and disinformation. So I don't know that I should have any real expectation for the media to properly frame and contextualize this moment clearly. But I do know this: that stick to sports shit is out the window. I'm Jemele Hill, and I approve this message.